When I was a college student in the late 1960s, Jonathan Kozol had just published a book, Death at an Early Age, that transfixed a nation and transformed my life. It was the clearest statement I had ever read on social injustice, and it served as a manifesto for change. In the nearly 50 years that have followed since that publication, Jonathan has been a clear and consistent champion for those who are disadvantaged and oppressed, telling their stories of their worlds and lives so that those of us who are more blessed will be also more committed to equity and equality. Books such as Fire in the Ashes, Rachel and Her Children, Homeless Families in America, and the deeply moving portrait, Amazing Grace. His lens is that of a teacher and educator, and his focus is on the systematic degradation of our children in schools that have diminishing expectations for them and rising segregation. Let me bring this home with one brief story, a story that our Congressman Elijah Cummings tells. His daughter went to a good local public school and excelled. And when she was in the 6th grade and graduating amongst the best in her class, the school said, "You really should send her to a private school." He did. And after the first month in the new school, they had teacher conference and was expecting to hear that their little daughter was a superstar. Instead, they were told she was failing 4 out of her 5 classes. How could this be? The stellar student is now failing 4 out of her 5 classes. Low expectations, perhaps. Segregation, perhaps. Please join me in welcoming a man who left a Rhodes Scholarship in England to go to Paris and learn to write with some of the best writers of the time, a man whose pen has stirred the nation to strive to do better for our children, and who continues to be one of their most articulate advocates, Jonathan Kozol.
Hello. How are you? Thanks very much to Bob. Thanks for all your kindness to me earlier today, and to Bob Lieberman and to the Urban Health Institute for bringing us together here today. But most of all, my thanks to each and every one of you sitting in this room, those of you working at the grassroots in communities of need. How many of you are doing that? Yes, I'm so glad. Neighborhood centers, treatment centers, outreach, counseling, intervention programs, social services of every kind. And because I'm an old teacher, I would add special thanks to those of you who work to heal the wounds of children. Any teachers here? Oh, great. I always feel safer when I'm in a room with teachers. I'm going to speak primarily today of stress and trauma in the lives of children. But before I do, I want to tell you very briefly how it is that I became involved with children in the first place. I started out in 1964 as a teacher in the segregated public schools of Boston, my hometown. I knew absolutely nothing about teaching. I never intended to become a teacher. I'd gone to Harvard, and then Oxford. When I came back to Boston, I was planning to return to the university to pursue a PhD. But that summer, the summer of '64, thousands of young people, white and black, from all over the country, were pouring down into Mississippi to try to break the back of apartheid in that state. And some of the first young people who went down there were murdered. I'm sure some of you remember. Have any of you seen the movie called Mississippi Burning? Well, it's not exactly accurate, but roughly that's the story of those three young people. And it kind of stunned the nation. I didn't know what I should do. I felt guilty going on with my academic plans at Harvard. So I got my little car. It was very little in those days. It was a VW Bug. And I drove across town, the black community where I'd never been before, even though I'd lived my whole life around Boston. And I went to a minister who was sort of the local representative of Dr. King, and I simply said to him, "May I be of use?" And he said, "Yes, young man, you can be." And he said, "I'm glad you didn't think you have to go to Mississippi to find racism in America, because we got plenty of it right here in our own front yard." I said, "What do you think I should do?" And he said, "Well, you've had a privileged education. I'd like to see you become a teacher and teach our children, share what you've gotten with our children." So I did. I just walked in the Boston School Department and I said, "I'm going to be a teacher." I'd never heard of certification. And they said, "Where'd you go to college?" I said, "Harvard." They said, "Well, then you can't be a teacher, because they don't teach you anything useful at Harvard." I said, "There must be some way I could do it." And they said, "You could be a sub." I said, "Why not? I'll be a sub." So the first time I ever taught, they put me into kindergarten. I was absolutely terrified. I had no idea what you're supposed to do with people that size. And to me, they were like gerbils. And I let them crawl all over me. But I survived, and they promoted me and made me a fourth grade teacher. And in one way or another, I've been working with low-income children, mostly black and Hispanic children, ever since. The last two decades, primarily in the South Bronx of New York, in a neighborhood called Mott Haven, which is the poorest single urban neighborhood in the United States, but not so different in its demographics than some of the poorest neighborhoods right here in Baltimore. I don't need to tell the people in this audience how many children living in the neighborhoods that I've described are under chronic stress when they come into school, and how many have already undergone traumatic injury long before they showed up in the door of their kindergarten class. Can you all hear me okay? Good. But now they're here, sitting in our classrooms. Now I'm speaking as an old elementary teacher now. Here they are, sitting in our classrooms. And from this point on, and for the next 6 years, there's only one adult who's going to be with them and observing them and interacting with them almost every single day, apart from members of their families, the adult who has the closest contact with these children, and the only one who's right there with them in the same room for 6 or 7 hours every day, 5 days a week, nearly 10 months a year, is, of course, their teacher. So the teacher is potentially a precious resource in uncovering the secret griefs that children often hold within their hearts. Teachers have gotten quite a bashing from the media in recent years. I don't know why, but teachers in the public schools seem to be the favorite scapegoats for conservatives for all the other sins of our society. But I know a lot of wonderful teachers, and these are people who would be great allies in the work you do if they had the opportunity. So the all-important question is whether our schools give a teacher time and opportunity to recognize the suffering a child undergoes. To sit down with a little girl, for instance, and let her vent her hopes and dreams and sorrows and her fears, so that the teacher has a chance to know the little person whom she's teaching. In the best suburban schools, you might say to you, I know what the privileged have because I grew up in privilege. And I have many friends who are very privileged in New York. My Harvard classmates, very wealthy people. And some of them still like me, so they're a little nervous with me. They think I want to redistribute their wealth, which I do. But they tell me, and I know what their children have. And I see what the kids I work with have. In the best suburban systems, teachers do have time to intervene and listen to a child because, among other reasons, their classes are so small. Typically, in the beautiful green velvet suburbs of America, I mean the really fancy ones where the water comes magically right up out of the grass. Never known how that happens, but Beverly Hills, for example, or in private schools like Sidwell Friends. Have you ever heard of that? In Washington, I spoke there not long ago. They typically have, in elementary grades, they typically have 16 to a class, or maybe 18 at the worst, sometimes less. And at the secondary level, the fancy New England boarding schools. Have you ever heard of Exeter or Andover? They have maximum class size of 12. So in those cases, a teacher really can listen to a child and intervene. But with the size of classes that I see in many inner-city schools, it's virtually impossible. This may not be true of Baltimore. In fact, if I say anything bad, assume that's not true of Baltimore, just all the other cities in America. But I walk into classes all the time where 28, 30, 32, even in Los Angeles, 40 children are packed into one room. In these situations, even the most sensitive and enlightened teachers have to give priority to discipline, to absolute control. And a troubled child is likely to be viewed solely as a problem for the teacher rather than a challenge for the teacher's empathetic capabilities. On top of this, the persistent mania of obsessive testing on standardized exams, which is traumatic in itself, and its inevitable consequence in pressuring teachers to teach only to the test, which in our inner-city schools now injects a threat of anxiety, tension, angst into almost every hour of the day. It's driving out almost every bit of child-centered listening and learning. Teachers are being told, do not let your children wander from the standards of the state. And nowadays it's called the Common Core. You ever heard of that? No. It's not very good. I assure you it was not written by Nobel Prize-winning poets. Those standards are written by mediocre semi-intellectuals, but they get adopted and then thrust down our throats. So teachers are being told, do not let your children wander from the standards. There's no time for wandering. There's no time to let them ask too many questions or tell too many stories. In many of these schools, virtually every minute of the morning, have any of you been in these schools that I'm talking about? How many? All right, well, you know then. In a lot of these schools, virtually every minute of the morning is assigned to a specific little chunk of mechanistic skill, decontextualized from anything. I call them little amputated pieces of proficiency, and they're correlated with items on the state exam. In these kinds of schools where teachers get the message that nothing really matters except the numbers you can paste on a little child's forehead from a state exam, a teacher's patient willingness to listen to a child will not help that teacher keep her job. In this miserable regimen, the teacher's only valued role is to pump the numbers. This pedagogic pathology has come to be a kind of national neurosis. I call it an addiction to enumeration. Do you see it here in Baltimore? It's very, I guess you're being polite because you have to work with the schools, but I see it everywhere. The trouble is that children want to ask their questions. They want to tell their stories. And the little ones, especially in first and second grade, are gifted artists at subverting lesson plans. They wave their fingers in your face. They're very squirmy little people. They nearly fall out of their chairs because they're so eager to capture your attention. I remember a class I visited where a little girl in the front row, right in front of me, was raising her hand like this and saying, ooh, 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 making horrible sounds as though she was going to die. And I didn't want her to die, so I called on her. And she just looked up and said, what? She didn't have anything to say. She just wanted me to recognize that she was there. So there's the teacher. There's the teacher with the standard written on the board, which you're supposed to do. You're supposed to do it in the exact language of the state standards, too. Am I right? Yeah. And so you can't say, like, we're going to learn a skill today. You have to say a proficiency. The bigger the word, the more educated you sound. So there's the teacher, and she's written the standard on the board, and she's doing her best to achieve the outcome mandated for that moment in the morning. When a little boy, and I'm thinking of a real child now that I know named Reginald, suddenly says, teacher, and she says, what? And he says, guess what? The children never tell you anything. They always make you guess. You have to guess. Guess what? And she's thinking, I don't know if I should take a chance on this. But Reginald's, he's a good little boy, and I know he likes me. So maybe he's going to help me reach my outcome. So she says, what? And he says, yesterday, on Sunday, I went to the zoo with my auntie and my uncle, and guess what? And she knows she's lost it. He says, what? He said, I saw a baby bear that had just been born, and his nose was wet and warm, and off he goes, piling on the ands and buts for one of those eternal run-on sentences which 6-year-olds are almost as good as William Faulkner. And sometimes at the end of all those ands and buts, at the end of it, there's a piece of hidden treasure, where that little child unveils something deep and secret in his soul, or in her soul. And good teachers use that piece of hidden treasure as the key to unlock motivation. But in these heavily test-driven schools, teacher has to cut them off. Never finds that treasure and will never know what lies within that child's heart. It's hard to think of anything that could be more damaging to a child's sense of spontaneity and joy. Once we lock a child's spirit into silent stone, that child may not ever dare to speak out in a voice of authenticity or pursue a curiosity into a secret place the technocrats of uniformity have never dreamt of. I think listening is terribly important. I'm going to come back to that at the end. See, when I was a young teacher, it was at least fashionable to listen to children. But those are the years of the Ericksonian Enlightenment. You ever read Erik Erikson? Robert Coles, Piaget? Listening to children was important, no longer. There's no time to let them tell their tales. I'm going to make two other points that matter to me deeply in the minutes that remain. Wholly apart from the traumatic damage done to many children by disorder and dysfunction in their homes, which I've seen many times, turbulence and turmoil, serious pathologies among some of the adults who surround them. Apart from that, there are other forms of trauma that are less familial and less individual in nature. As very great psychologists like Dr. Kenneth Clark, remember him? How many remember his name? Yes. And Dr. Robert Coles, as countless psychiatrists and psychologists like them have told us, as Dr. Martin Luther King told us repeatedly, and as Brown versus Board of Education told us unequivocally, the damage done to black and Hispanic children by separate and unequal educational provision does injury to the hearts and minds that may never be reversible. I'm paraphrasing the Warren Court. This kind of injury, which is systematic and has now returned with a vengeance to our cities over the past 30 years, has nothing to do with the pathology of parents or any insufficiency that we attach to individual behavior. This is a publicly created and socially perpetuated injury to those who are its victims. And as I said, it's grown increasingly severe over the past 3 decades. At this regressive moment in our nation's history, black and Hispanic children in our public schools are more isolated intellectually and segregated physically than at any time since 1968, the year when Dr. King was taken from us. Now, a lot of people don't like to talk about this. President Obama spoke about it while he was campaigning. He held up one of my books, but I never mentioned it once he was elected. They don't, because this is a difficult issue for them to deal with. So instead they talk about the individual failings of parents or teachers for that matter. But I'm old-fashioned. I happen to believe that Dr. King was right, that racial isolation in and of itself does tremendous damage to the young mentalities of children by giving them the message that they have been set apart like an infectious subspecies of the population, so that they cannot contaminate the education of the white and middle class. I still believe this represents a sin against the highest moral values of a genuine democracy. And I don't think this ought to be ignored in social service settings. That schools of education, the one at Harvard, for example, they never talk about this anymore. There's terrible acquiescence in what I call our nation's greatest theological evil. It's hard for someone like myself to bear, since I grew up at a time of when young people were courageous and selfless and wanted to change the evils that they saw. But to be absolutely candid with you, I hate to say this, I don't think this is going to change in my lifetime or in yours, unless you're one of the very little people in this room. So I'd like to end this talk instead with something that conceivably could change and could make a major difference in the lives of children, traumatized or not. I'm speaking now about the millions of impoverished children who never get the benefits of preschool education and early childhood care, except on a very partial basis, token basis, despite the claims that states and cities make. The vast majority of inner-city children that I meet everywhere I go come into kindergarten with, at most, maybe 1 year of half-day preschool, something of that sort, if they're lucky. As my dear friend Marion Wright Edelman, the Children's Defense Fund, has emphasized repeatedly, more than half the eligible 3- and 4-year-olds in our nation get nothing at all. And every president promises that this is going to happen when he or she is elected. That I can think of 4 presidents who promised this. That when you elect me, I'm going to make sure that every child enters school prepared to learn. You ever heard that? I think that was George Bush Sr., perhaps. Bill Clinton made similar types of promises. George Bush II, however you say it, George the Younger, made the same type of promise, and President Obama has made the same kind of promise. In his case, he actually tried, but he couldn't get more than a pittance of it through the Congress. I don't understand this. With all we know of neurological and psychological development in those very early years of life, not only that, but just to speak of social development, wholly apart from academic preparation. With all we know about the prime importance of those years, it's quite remarkable that right here in the richest country in the world, we still do not provide these programs on a universal basis, and therefore lose the opportunity to recognize the traumas that these children face, what traumatic episodes they've already undergone, or in the best of cases, intervene preventively before the damage has been done. And of course, on top of this, those children also lose the early learning opportunities that are given almost universally nowadays to children of the affluent. And I mean, I know, when I speak of affluent people, they're people I know. You know, I said, you know, I have these very wealthy classmates in New York. And I know, you know, the next generation, their children, who typically followed them to places like Harvard, Yale, or if they were from the South, the Mid-South, Johns Hopkins, or Duke, you know, and they went to elite colleges, and I know what they do for their children or grandchildren. They typically start them in these terrific developmental pre-K programs when they're 2.5 years old, or often 2 years old. And in New York City, at least, in Manhattan, they're very hard to get into and expensive. I believe that for at one of those preschools that's you know, all the best elements of Montessori and Sylvia Ashton Warner and all Ericksonian ideals. I think it costs now about $30,000 for a 2.5-year-old for a year, or maybe a little more. And I always think, you know, how little is a 2.5-year-old? You know, I wonder how much is that per pound. But the parents, these are people who pay for it privately. The parents know it's worth it. The top pre-Ks in New York are called the Little Ivies, right? First step to the top colleges in the nation. Not even a pretense of a meritocracy, right? It's not simply an act of thievery from our poorest children, but it's, in a sense, it's an irreversible theft, because we can't return those years at any later time. You only, you know, get to be a 2-year-old or 3-year-old a single time. This is it. And once it's gone forever. And all the promises of presidents and politicians can never give you back those years again. If I had the power, here's what I would do. If I were President of the United States, or if I had the ear of the President, and I knew he would obey me, here's what I'd do. I'd take all that money that's going now to multi-billion-dollar testing corporations, and I'd pour it into 3 full years of rich, exciting, joyful, and enlightened full-day preschool education, and two preceding years of early childhood development with wraparound services, the kind that many of you provide right now, pediatric, dental, vision screening, all the rest of it as an inherent part of the same program. That's what I do. And you know, nowadays, some kids are getting 3 years of pre-K and before kindergarten. By the time they're in 4th grade, they've had like 7 years of education. And poor kids have had just the years since they entered kindergarten. But they're all obliged to take the same exams, right? And, you know, guess which ones are going to be found gifted and talented and set early on in the track that leads to higher education, and which ones, on the other hand, are going to be labeled developmentally delayed. So that's why I think this is terribly important. Instead of castigating parents always for poor decision-making, and insufficient parenting abilities. And I hear that all the time, and sometimes it's true. But instead of castigating, I mean, it's almost always the consequence of their own traumatic childhoods, in the case of the parents, or their own rotten education in separate and unequal schools. They're not of their grandparents, you know. There's generational debilitation, the very opposite of the privilege, the intergenerational privilege of the affluent. Instead of castigating parents, you can't give the parents back their childhood. Instead of castigating them always for poor decision-making, we ought to add a parenting component to these pre-K programs with counseling and coaching and, where it's needed, practical assistance, too. Would this cost a lot? I've discussed this with members of the Senate. Some years ago, before he passed away, I had 4 long conversations with my senator from Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy, about this, and subsequently with Tom Harkin, who's just retiring this year, and other members of the Senate. And we talk about the cost. And yes, it would cost a lot to do this. It might cost about a quarter of the amount of money that we're spending each year in the Middle East wars. But it's a cost this nation can afford. You know, no matter what I read about, we're not wholly out of the recession yet and so forth. The affluent are way out of the recession. I mean the super affluent. You know, you can tell in New York City, and I'm sure here in the harbor area, you know, those expensive stores are packed. They're full of people. Stores in New York like Saks Fifth Avenue. Somebody's got money. You see the advertisements on the front page of the New York Times now? I never thought they'd degenerate to that point where they put ads on the front page. Or on the second page, they're all lined up. Tiffany, I don't know, different fancy stores. And somebody has money. If the governments of other affluent democracies, in Europe, for example, can do this for their children, from the cradle is the term they use in France. From the cradle, la crèche. If all these nations that are our economic rivals and our democratic partners have been doing this for decades now, we can do it too. And it's not politically impossible. Several members of the Senate, as I've indicated, have told me through the years that they believe this is something realistic in political respects. Not, you know, it's not going to happen right away. It's not going to be easy. But it is politically conceivable. And I'd like to put my final emphasis on something that is conceivable. You know, there are huge problems out there. I can't change all of them. But I have a slogan that I keep over my desk. It's been there for 50 years. It says, look for battles big enough to matter, but small enough to win. And that's how I think of the pre-K struggle. It's something we can win. And when I say pre-K, I don't mean the sort of symbolic pre-K that every state claims to have. New York State, for example, has something called universal pre-K. But it actually serves only 26% of eligible children. There's a funny definition of universal. And I don't mean something that's on a hit-or-miss basis, you know, dependent on local states or cities and their budget crises and the like, but a program that's funded as a national entitlement of childhood from the real wealth of our country. That's my belief. It would take an awful lot of pressure upon members of both parties to achieve this goal, but it's something we truly could achieve if we're willing to be unrelenting and, in this respect, openly political. You're not going to get this by complaining, you know. I'm told there's at least one public school in Baltimore that does provide many of the services I just described. Am I correct, Bob? Is this the school that the program is funded in part by the Weinstein Foundation? Yeah, well, I applaud them for doing that. I believe it starts when a child's only 6 months old. That's the kind of program, in my own belief, that ought to be a model for America. You know. And I get so weary. I hear politicians, even my educated Harvard friends, allegedly educated, they'll look at me and they'll say, Jonathan, would that really make a difference for those children? Children who live in those neighborhoods, I guess, is more politically correct. And I always say, I don't know, it seems to do the trick for your kids, doesn't it? That's my own belief. If it's, I always say, if rich, wonderful developmental preschool, and I don't mean, drilling test prep starting at 2.5. I mean wonderful developmental education. If this is good for the I don't know, the son of a Wall Street CEO or the daughter of a prosperous physician or an affluent attorney, then it's good for the poorest child of the poorest black, Hispanic, or white woman in America. That's what I don't believe. And it's well past time to keep this promise to our children. I'm going to end this on a personal note. I'm in an age when time increasingly feels precious. Many people that I've relied upon for guidance in my own work with children have been taken from this world over the past 10 or 15 years. It may surprise the young people here, but no matter how old you are, it always helps to have someone a little older and wiser who sort of sanctions what you're doing, or gives you the courage to keep on. I'm thinking now, especially of my oldest and closest friend in education, probably the best friend little children had for about 50 years, a sweet and wise man, a healer, if there ever was one, by the name of Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' neighbor. And he was a very good listener to children. It is why they loved him, I believe. Once when he and I were in New York together, we'd done some kind of event together in front of an audience, and we were done early. It was only about noon, and he asked me if I'd bring him up with me to the South Bronx to see the neighborhood where my books took place, and he was very modest. He said, I don't want to intimidate them. I thought that was amusing that Mr. Rogers could intimidate anybody. I teased him. I said, I think they can handle it. So he said, how do you usually go? And I said, on the train, number 6 train, no trolley in New York. So, he said, okay, let's go on the train. He liked that idea. So down we went to the smelly New York subway, and just about 6 stops from the richest, the poorest neighborhood in the city to a stop called Brook Avenue in the South Bronx. We got out there and walked up Brook Ave, and which at that time was like the worst street in the Bronx for drugs, for heroin. It was so bad that, like, dealers had their own square on the sidewalk. Can you imagine what I mean? You couldn't use another person's square. The drug lord rented out squares to different dealers. And there's Mr. Rogers and I walking up Brook Avenue, and I wondered, would anybody know who he was anymore? That was a needless worry. A sanitation truck suddenly came screeching to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged black man, jumped out of the cab and lifted Mr. Rogers off the ground. And then we went to a public school. There was one public school in that neighborhood that I particularly loved, where the principal was still deeply rooted in the whole idea of educating the whole child, and was just beloved in the community. And we went into kindergarten, and I swear the teachers were even more moved than the children. And he squeezed himself into one of those little teeny chairs, and they listened to the children. And then, at the end of school, we went around the block to an after-school program in a church, Episcopal church, where some of my books take place. And it's packed. The school just let out. There are about 90 children packed into this room, having their snack. And at the far end of the room, there's a little boy named Mario, whom I particularly liked. A very slightly plump little boy, chubby little boy, and you know, he was only 6 then. And kids that age, if they don't like you, they can make it painfully obvious. But if they like you, you're in for it. And right away he spots Mr. Rogers, and he goes right at him across the room with his arms spread out. Because he's plump, like a little jet-powered bumblebee. You know. At the moment of collision, he wrapped his arms around Mr. Rogers' head, gave him a big kiss on the forehead, and said, "Welcome to my neighborhood, Mr. Rogers." Fred said later, the sadness is that we don't welcome him to ours. Well, now he's gone. When I knew Mr. Rogers was ill, I knew he was dying, he had cancer. I used to pray just like a child, God, please let him live just 1 more year, or 2 years, or 3. I'd bargain with God a little bit. I come from a Jewish family of entrepreneurs. People own stores. I'm good at bargaining. And besides, I know Christians can't bargain with God, but Jewish people knew him longer. You know, I'd say, God, he's such a good man and has been a healer to so many children in this world. Let him live forever. But of course, I knew he can't. None of us can. We all know we're going to die someday and lose the ones we love the most to death. The innocence and playfulness and whimsicality and spontaneity of children will outlive us all. My friends, life goes so fast. Use it well. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.